This is East Asia Tonight.
Good Friday evening. I'm Oteli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. No backing down by the Philippines, even after an agreement to de-escalate, as China reasserts a demand to withdraw from disputed areas of the South China Sea. The NATO summit ends with the US and South Korea signing a joint nuclear strategy to counter Pyongyang's escalating military activity, just weeks after North Korea's defense pact with Russia. Japan's annual defense white paper highlights national security threats from China, North Korea, and Russia, detailing Tokyo's plans to bolster its capabilities in response. Meanwhile, President Biden claims that he has slowed China's influence in the Indo-Pacific and is now working to curb Beijing's cooperation with Russia. And China racks up a record trade surplus. Exports are higher, but imports sharply lower in a sign of continuing weakness in domestic demand. Still ahead on East Asia tonight, Chinese EVs may face import curbs in the West, but they're warmly welcomed in Africa. Our special report explains why. Also ahead, China's defunct one-child policy resulted in the abandonment of countless baby girls at birth. CNA's new documentary, Daughters of Putian, follows their path to reunite with their biological parents. China has urged the Philippines to immediately withdraw personnel and ships that it says are illegally stationed at Sabina Shoal on the Spratly Islands. Well, the Chinese Defense Ministry also warned Manila to stop, quote, heading down the wrong path. And this comes as the Philippines says it will stand its ground in clashes over the South China Sea, despite an agreement last week to de-escalate tensions over the disputed waters. The Philippine National Security Advisor, Eduardo Ano, stressed that Manila would not back down against tactics that seek to jeopardize the country's security and stability. Now, he gave those remarks at a forum marking the 8th anniversary of an arbitral ruling that upheld his country's maritime claims in the South China Sea. Beijing does not recognize the 2016 ruling. Well, tensions over the strategic waterway have soared in recent months, following a series of confrontations between Philippine and Chinese ships. A skirmish in June left a Filipino sailor injured. And on Wednesday, Chinese aircraft carrier Shandong passed close to northern Philippines, triggering concern in Manila. Beijing says that the recent far-sea combat training is a routine annual arrangement and that the Navy will keep holding similar exercises in the future. Well, China, meantime, has rebuked the European Union over a statement released by the bloc on the anniversary of the arbitration ruling. The EU says it views the 2016 decision as legally binding, including the finding that the Second Thomas Shoal falls within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. The bloc added that the ruling represents a significant milestone in a resolution of disputes in the South China Sea. The Chinese mission to the EU opposed that statement, accusing the bloc of ignoring historical and objective facts. It says that the EU blatantly endorses Manila's violation of China's alleged sovereignty. And for more analysis, let's speak with Buena Bernal, and she joins us live from Manila. So, Buena, tell us essentially how does the Philippines plan to effectively assert its rights and interests in the South China Sea when in practice it's actually unable to enforce its claims against a much more powerful China?
Analysts are saying that the Philippines can utilize a host of actions in the domestic and international level, employing efforts in the diplomatic, military, and economic spheres. Bilaterally, it can continue to engage China. It can continue to shore up international support for that 2016 arbitral award that invalidated China's claim of historic rights over waters and resources within that so-called 9- now 10- line. And the Philippines also has the option of filing a fresh suit against China over recent actions of the China Coast Guard that it has labeled as illegal and deceptive. But perhaps just as important, in asserting its rights over the West Philippine Sea, which is how the Philippines calls its maritime zone in the larger South China Sea, is what the Philippines can also do domestically. Militarily, it can focus on improving or modernizing its armed forces as part of deterrent. Economics-wise, the Philippines economic officials can help ensure that the country has the capacity to maximize the potential oil and gas reserves within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. Because even if the Philippines protests what think tanks call cabbage strategy, or the swarming of Chinese vessels in certain areas of the sea, specifically in areas where the Philippines sends its survey ships for possible oil exploration, sustaining that oil exploration is another matter. It means finding the right private stakeholder partners and attracting investments. And you also have civilian stakeholdership, for example, where activists today, to mark that 8th anniversary of the arbitral award, also gathered in Manila. But finally, even when it comes to taking care of its own, such as civilians like fishermen who go out in the deep sea, in the West Philippine Sea, more can be done social protection-wise. You know, the Philippines can have an emergency assistance fund for disasters out at sea, similar to its standby funds for natural disasters like typhoons. It can conduct more patrols by the Philippine Coast Guard, meaning to say that also involves giving the Philippine Coast Guard more assets than it currently has. And I spoke to a family of fishermen recently and found out just how important these efforts are to them.
An array of deep-sea fish welcome early morning visitors at the Subic fish port in the Philippines' northwestern coast. Among them are the catch of fisherfolk in and around Scarborough Shoal, a chain of reefs and rocks ruled by a 2016 arbitral tribunal as a common fishing ground among artisanal fisherfolk of Vietnam, the Philippines, and China, including Taiwan. 8 years ago, the International Tribunal ruled against China's expansive claims in the South China Sea. An arbitral tribunal under the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague said there was no evidence that China had historically exercised exclusive control over the waters and resources there.
Among the boats that frequent the vicinity of Scarborough Shoal is this one. Despite a Chinese regulation threatening to detain those China considers as maritime trespassers, the fishing crew of this boat still decided to head back near the shoal where their fish aggregating device is located.
Fisherman Freddie Legaspi was one of those who returned near the shoal despite China's new regulation that was implemented nearly a month ago.
Minsan po kasi pag malapit kami doon sa Boro, tinataboy po kami ng Chinese Coast Guard, pinapalayo. Imbis na madali kami pumunta sa payaw namin, napapalayo tuloy kami. Medyo nangangamba po ngayon dahil sinabihan din kami ng amo namin na mag-iingat dahil nga doon sa policy nila na yun nga manghuhuli nga ng mga mangingisda papasok doon sa Scarborough Shoal. Bali yung payaw po kasi namin doon malapit. Kaya obligado kaming puntahan yun. Doon kasi kami nanguhuli ng mga isda na iuwi namin.
A fish aggregating device that's used to attract fish, locally known as payaw, can cost upwards of $1,300 US. It's a steep investment for local fisherfolk and boat owners who refuse to abandon such devices out at sea despite possible run-ins with the Chinese Coast Guard. In late June, their boat's engine exploded 17 nautical miles southwest of Scarborough. Freddie waited 2 hours while suffering second-degree burns before being rescued. The Philippine Coast Guard accused the Chinese Coast Guard of initially blocking its rescue mission that was heading to help Freddie. Freddie's parents know the dangers of deep-sea fishing all too well. Freddie's brother Rodrigo remains missing since a 2006 deep-sea fishing expedition he joined. Their boat never got back to shore. Freddie's wife, Lawrence, is also worried about the medical costs for his burn injuries.
Mas maganda po yung ganun, may nakahanda po yung gobyerno natin na tulong para sa mga mangingisda, sa mga ganito pong aksidente para opo. Kasi doon lang din po talaga sa karamihan umaasa sa pangingisda lang po talaga. Doon sila nabubuhay po. Kaya sana anuhin po rin po ng gobyerno na patuloy na bantayan nila yung mga Pinoy na nasa Scarborough po.
Scarborough Shoal's inner lagoon has been effectively controlled by China since 2012, despite the 2016 arbitral award. The ruling also declared that certain areas of the sea, including the Second Thomas Shoal and Mischief Reef, are within the exclusive economic zone and continental shelf of the Philippines.
So, Bueno, we've seen civilians like, some of the fishermen there clearly affected by all the escalating tensions between China and Philippines. What else can be done to sort of de-escalate tensions and just make things better for their livelihoods?
Well, the Philippines and China did commit to de-escalate tensions during their 9th bilateral consultation mechanism held last July 2, I should say, here in Manila. What's happening right now is also a battle of narratives, with the Philippines employing that transparency initiative where it is shedding light on how its crew and its assets are treated by Chinese authorities out at sea. But you also see the release of papers or white papers by Chinese experts, for example, the extent of coral damage in Second Thomas Shoal, where the Philippines has a grounded World War II ship that serves as a military outpost, and contrast that to its report on the health of coral reef systems in Scarborough Shoal, which China has controlled since 2012, basically sending the message that it is doing a good job protecting the marine environment in the area. So one analyst I spoke to says, this is a counter-transparency initiative by China. Another commented that although this is a battle of the white papers, it is still better than a brawl out at sea, which is what happened last mid-June when we saw a Filipino sailor injured and where Chinese authorities wielded bladed weapons at Philippine Navy personnel. Now, Philippine security officials have also countered what they consider as malign influence operations of China. They have a new communication strategy, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, explicitly labeling China's actions as ICAD, which stands for illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive. And it's also packaging the West Philippine Sea issue as an issue of rights and future of Filipinos. And security officials are saying that part of this Chinese malign influence operations is really designed to divert the public's attention from the real issue, which they say is China's expansive claim of almost the entire South China Sea. So as part of utilizing peaceful settlement of disputes, the Philippines also submitted to the United Nations its extended continental shelf claim, and the hope is that this submission will jumpstart negotiations with other claimant states that have challenged the Philippines' extended continental shelf claim.
I appreciate that report there. Do take care of your scratchy throat. Bueno Banal there, speaking to us live from Manila. Now, the United States and South Korea have signed a joint nuclear strategy to deter and respond to North Korea. It comes weeks after Pyongyang struck a defense pact with Moscow, deepening concerns in the region about the North's growing nuclear threats. Now, meeting on the sidelines of the NATO summit, U.S. President Joe Biden told his South Korean counterpart, Yoon Suk-yeol, that Washington's commitment to deterrence against Pyongyang is backed by the full range of U.S. capabilities, including nuclear. Both leaders also authorized a guideline formalizing the deployment of U.S. nuclear assets on and around the Korean peninsula. Now, the first such guidelines agreed between the two countries are part of an effort to flesh out Washington's commitment to Seoul. It aims to counter nuclear and military threats from Pyongyang. Well, a joint statement by the two leaders stressed that any nuclear attack by North Korea against the South will be met with a swift, overwhelming, and decisive response. North Korea has been openly advancing its nuclear weapons policy, codifying their use in the event of perceived threat against its territory. It also enshrined the advancement of nuclear weapons capability in the Constitution last year. The Western military alliance, NATO, is hailing closer ties with the Indo-Pacific. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg citing strong and deepening cooperation at the alliance's summit. Well, he welcomed NATO's Indo-Pacific partners to the summit in Washington, D.C. The so-called Pacific Four are Australia, Japan, New Zealand and South Korea. Well, this is the third time they are taking part in the gathering. Mr. Stoltenberg says they plan to launch new joint projects in disinformation, cybersecurity, AI and support to Ukraine. And they also plan to expand cooperation in defense industries. NATO and Seoul signed a certification for airworthiness for military aircraft made in South Korea. It's unclear how the Pacific partners can support Ukraine. They met Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on the sidelines. The NATO chief says the security concerns around the Ukraine war are interlinked with Asia, alleging again that China is a decisive enabler, inciting North Korea's alleged role in Russia's war campaign.
Russia's illegal war against Ukraine is supported by China, by Iran, but not least by North Korea. And North Korea has delivered huge amounts of ammunition, continues to deliver ammunition and the military support to Russia's illegal war. And of course, this is not something North Korea is doing for free. We are very concerned about the potential support that Russia may deliver to North Korea's nuclear missile programs.
In the meantime, U.S. President Joe Biden says that he's limited China's influence in the Indo-Pacific and remains prepared to communicate America's stance to his Chinese counterpart if necessary. The U.S. leader added that he's working to curb China's cooperation with Russia amid fears it may be supporting Moscow in its war in Ukraine.
China has to understand that if they are supplying Russia with information and capacity, along with working with North Korea and others to help Russia in armament, that they're not going to benefit economically as a consequence of that by getting the kind of investment they're looking for.
Mr. Biden said his lines of communication with the Chinese leader remain open, but that he's not ready to speak with the Russian president unless he changes his behavior. Coming up next on East Asia Tonight, the striking union at Samsung Electronics is ramping up pressure as it looks to encourage workers at the firm's AI plants to join the walk-off. The day, or didn't they? Top Japanese policymakers break their recent silence on the yen after an overnight spike raised speculation the government may have intervened in the forex market. You're watching East Asia Tonight right here on CNA. Japan's annual defense white paper identifies threats to national security posed by China, North Korea and Russia. It also spells out Tokyo's plans to upgrade Japanese capabilities in response. CNA's Michio Ishida has more.
The white paper stresses the increasingly uncertain security environment around Japan and marks out threats to territory, including the Senkaku Islands, which China also claims and calls Diaoyu. Tokyo says Beijing is stepping up attempts to change the status quo by force, pointing also to its intensifying military activity around the Taiwan Strait and in the South China Sea. The paper says China has expanded its military might rapidly and has not been transparent about its defense spending. It adds that China's growing cooperation with Russia is meant as a show of force against Japan. The white paper criticized Russia for its invasion of Ukraine and for its continued military activities in Japan's northern territories, or the Kuril Islands, which Russia illegally occupied at the end of World War II and has not returned. Like last year, it identifies North Korea as posing a grave and imminent threat. Tokyo fears it has ballistic missiles designed to carry nuclear warheads that can strike the Japanese archipelago. In response to these threats, Japan is developing its capabilities in areas such as integrated air and missile defense and unmanned defense. It will also establish joint operations, command of air, maritime, and ground forces this fiscal year to ensure a coordinated response. Japan's defense budget rose to 1.6% of its GDP in fiscal year 2024. The increased defense expenditure from about 1% is part of Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's national security strategy announced in December 2022. But even as Japan's capabilities are being upgraded, fewer Japanese want to take up arms. Its self-defense forces recruited fewer than 10,000 new personnel in the last fiscal year, or just half their target. Authorities are looking at ways to tap artificial intelligence to improve efficiency. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
Well, it's time now for your business news. And it's a mixed picture in China's latest trade numbers, with exports surging by more than expected in June. However, falling imports dampen hopes of a steady recovery in the wider economy. Overseas shipments surged by 8.6% on year in June, picking up from May's 7.6% rise. Meanwhile, imports underwhelmed expectations, falling from a year earlier by 2.3%, reversing a 1.8% gain in the month before. Now, that widened China's trade surplus to a record $99.5 billion. Well, exports have been one of the few bright spots in the past half year as the pace of economic growth continues to struggle. But shrinking imports are a sign of persistent weakness in domestic demand, despite the government's stimulus efforts following the pandemic. A prolonged property slump and worries about jobs and wages all weighing heavily on consumer confidence. Well, the largest workers' union at Samsung Electronics is upping the ante. It's calling on staff at the firm's most advanced AI memory chip plants to join an ongoing strike. Well, the campaign is showing signs of losing steam as fewer employees attend the rallies. Well, several hundred employees joined the protests yesterday and today in front of Samsung's high-bandwidth memory site at Pyeongtaek in the south of Seoul. Well, that's a far cry from the thousands who turned up outside Samsung's main facility on Monday. The National Samsung Electronics Union says it has more than 30,000 members, about a quarter of the firm's workforce in South Korea. The Pyeongtaek site is vital to Samsung's efforts to carve out a slice of the important AI market. A chip maker is in the process of trying to convince NVIDIA to use its high-bandwidth memory as it competes with smaller rival SK Hynix. The union had said that it would first target production lines that rely more on human labor. Now, much of Samsung's overall production, however, is automated. Samsung says that there are no problems in production, but the head of the trade union said he was receiving reports of significant disruptions as equipment lays idle following the staff walkout. Now, meantime, Samsung's shares are under pressure in a broader sell-off in Asian tech counters, and they fell as much as 4%, the biggest intraday decline in more than 2 months, closing about 3.7% lower. Now, South Korea has set its hourly minimum wage for next year to 10,031 or $7.30. Well, this is the first time the rate surpassed the 10,001 mark. But the increment of 1.7% from last year is the second lowest on record. Now, that decision was made at a plenary meeting with the country's minimum wage commission. Some labor representatives had walked out of that meeting, protesting that the increase was simply too low. Well, they had initially asked for 12,601 as the new minimum. Management suggested a freeze. The 2025 hourly wage will translate into 2.1 million won, or around $1,523 per month, based on a 40-hour work week. The Labour Ministry is required to publicly announce 2025's minimum wage by 5th of August. Labour unions or managements can submit a formal objection to the new figure. If the ministry considers the request reasonable, it can ask the Commission to reassess the rate, but no reconsideration has taken place so far. Top Japanese policymakers have broken their recent silence on the yen's movements after an overnight spike raised speculation that the government may have intervened in the currency market. Well, most officials reiterated that they are ready to step in if needed, but kept mum on whether any moves were made recently. Japan's top currency diplomat Masato Kanda told reporters that recent yen moves were out of line with fundamentals. However, he declined to comment on whether authorities had intervened. Finance Minister Shinichi Suzuki also noted that the rapid, one-sided moves in the foreign exchange market were undesirable, but declined to comment on whether authorities made rate checks. The Nikkei earlier reported that Japan's central bank conducted a rate check against the euro. Similarly, Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshimasa Hayashi signaled that authorities are prepared to take all possible measures to stop excessive yen depreciation. Despite the remarks, analysts are questioning the effectiveness of the government's action on the weakening yen. The dollar currently stronger against the yen, fetching about 159 and had fallen as low as 157.4 overnight, its weakest since mid-June. Well, turning to stock market action now in East Asia, they are mainly lower, tracking overnight declines on Wall Street. The weakness coming mainly from tech counters. The Nikkei 225 and TAIEX both retreating from yesterday's record highs. The Nikkei in particular down 2.45%, which is its biggest drop this year. Well, the threat of currency intervention also encouraged investors to take profits ahead of a long weekend. The Kospi ending lower as well, posting its first weekly decline in 6, dragged by tech heavyweights like Samsung. Greater China stocks also mixed, mirroring the June trade data. Hong Kong's Hang Seng, the outperformer, closing nearly 2.6% higher on the back of property stocks. That's a speculation of interest rate cuts boost hopes of a recovery in home sales. All right, time now for a short break, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, China quietly drives an electric vehicle revolution in parts of Africa as resistance to its exports grow in the West. And we'll be speaking to an expert for more insight. No backing down by the Philippines, even after an agreement to de-escalate, as China reasserts a demand to withdraw from disputed areas of the South China Sea. Japan's annual defense white paper highlights national security threats from China, North Korea, and Russia, detailing Tokyo's plans to bolster its capabilities in response. And President Biden claims he has slowed China's influence in the Indo-Pacific and is now working to curb Beijing's cooperation with Russia. Now, in East Asia tonight, we've previously covered how China's dominance in electric vehicles has triggered a widening gulf between countries which want them and politicians who don't. But in Africa, there is no sign of the growing trade tensions between Beijing and the West. Instead, a number of African governments are welcoming Chinese EV imports and local production by Chinese manufacturers. Isaac Lukando reports from Tanzania.
Dar es Salaam, a busy, bustling place, is like many African cities being transformed by a surge in electric vehicles. 2- and 3-wheelers dominate the roads here, and they're rapidly being switched out for electric mopeds with the help of China. Zakia Thabit, a food delivery driver, made the transition a couple of years ago because she could no longer afford the fuel.
Huwa sina matumizi makubwa ya kama chombo cha mafuta. Ni chombo kizuri ambacho kinaweza kusaidia kama mimi kijana mdogo ambaye nafanya kazi.
The company Zakia works for, Peking, imported 32 electric mopeds from China in 2021 and says the move has resulted in reporting healthier profit margins since the move. Still, adopting electric vehicles has not been without its challenges. Chief among them is their relatively short lifespan.
Kuna masuala ya betri na utunzaji wa chombo kwa maana ya ile body ni viko rahisi sana kuharibika.
Tanzania is one of East Africa's leading countries in the switch to electric, motivated among other reasons by a desire to cut air pollution. There are over 5,000 EVs on the roads, the highest number in the region, and growing.
Some local ride-hailing apps now let you request an electric vehicle like this one, which is a cheaper option compared to regular cars with combustion engines.
In the past few years, at least 10 companies have entered Tanzania's e-mobility market. Tri is one of them, importing parts for 3-wheelers from China and assembling them in its factories. It has sold over 90 units so far, offers affordable vehicles to professional drivers through a lease-to-own scheme, and has ambitions to expand across Africa.
We have suppliers, people interested from different countries like Malawi, Congo, Ethiopia, Zambia. They're all inquiring on how we can send them shipments directly to them.
Despite tax-free incentives on imports, Tanzania's EV industry faces other challenges to growth: limited funding, a shortage of technicians, and low consumer awareness.
It will take a minute for someone to believe that you can charge a vehicle for 2 hours and drive 100 kilometers. And they always wonder, what if I want to drive 110 kilometers? Which is obvious, like if your phone die, you know your phone is dying, you'll charge, especially if you're using it for work. So it's the same thing, but adaptation is a process.
Since 2009, Beijing has provided subsidies and tax breaks to Chinese EV manufacturers, thus allowing them to sell to overseas markets relatively cheaply. In Africa, trade in EVs is dominated by the import of components from China. But there is also increasing interest for Chinese car makers to form local partnerships. This has led to the creation of jobs and given a leg up to budding efforts to build a domestic EV industry. As Western countries debate the merits of opening up their markets to Chinese manufacturers, industry experts here expect to see more EVs on African roads, boosting economies and providing quieter experiences on the road. Isaac Lucando, CNA, Dar es Salaam.
And for more insights, Stephen Dyer joins us from Shanghai. He is a co-leader of Alexis Partners Greater China Business, and he's also the head of the firm's Asia Automotive and Industrials Consulting Practice. Well, thanks so much for joining us this evening, Stephen. First up, perhaps you could help us understand and share some of the key findings from your firm's latest report on the East Asian EV market, and what do they mean for the industry?
Well, thanks, Oteli. We recently published an Alex Partners Global Automotive Outlook, which is an annual review of what's going on in the auto industry. And again, this year, the story really is China. China has become the center of gravity for the automotive industry, and particularly electric vehicles. There are more electric vehicles sold in China than anywhere else in the world, made up about 40% of all vehicle sales in China so far this year. We expect by 2030 it'll reach over 3/4. So that's been the result of a combination of government subsidies to build the industry, an interest by Chinese consumers in intelligent technology, and just a proliferation of value for money and attractive options for vehicles. Over 137 brands of electric vehicles are now for sale in China. So we looked at the 70s and 80s as the advent of Japanese car makers around the world, maybe the 90s for Korean car makers, the 2010s for new EV startups like Tesla. It's possible now we're at the forefront of the advent of the China age in the automotive industry globally.
Yeah, 137 brands. That's pretty impressive coming out of China. But let's just talk about, in terms of challenges and opportunities, I mean, what does the African market present for Chinese EV manufacturers? And I guess that these EVs will also have to adapt to local needs, right?
Right. The Chinese market is highly competitive. We've undergone about 18 months of a price war in China. So that drives a lot of Chinese automakers to look outside of China for markets in which they can sell their vehicles at a better margin. So Southeast Asia, Europe, Oceania, and of course Africa and the Middle East are target markets for them. The demand for EVs in these markets has not reached the level of China's EV demand, and that's because a lot of the markets either lack the government subsidies to make them cost-effective for consumers, or the charging infrastructure that's so prolific in China. But as the cost of EVs come down and there's price parity with regular gasoline-powered vehicles, that will overcome one of those obstacles. And the next obstacle will really be about, is it easy to find a charging station in those markets? And when those things converge, then I think you'll see a pickup in many markets, including Africa.
You're right. So as the cost of EVs come down, can Africa absorb, say, the spare capacity from these Chinese EV makers? And what are some of the implications for the local industry?
Yeah, the rule of thumb in the automotive industry generally is long-term, you want to make cars where you sell them. And so exports of cars from China recently, and in the past from Japan and Korea and Germany, typically have been short to medium term solutions. So As the market grows to enough volume to support local assembly operations, we typically see a step where exporters will then begin assembling what we call semi-knockdown kits, and then completely knockdown kits. And then later, as the volume reaches a certain scale, you'll see the local development of an automotive ecosystem. That's happened in many places in Southeast Asia, especially in Thailand. It's beginning in Vietnam. I expect to see that in Africa longer term, but probably not in the short term.
And Stephen, what's your take on Chinese EV makers like BYD? They're expanding operations, despite the trade war and slowing demand. I mean, is it a sustainable move at the rate of their expansion?
Well, companies like BYD have undergone really unexpected growth over the last couple of years. So BYD is clearly a success story from the Chinese stable of automakers. According to our recent study, of the 137 EV brands in China, we expect by 2030, only about 19 of them will have achieved sufficient scale to be viable, profitable. That doesn't mean that you won't have more than that in the market, because consolidation takes a long time, especially in China. But it's going to be a struggle. So not all the brands will survive. Some will be bought, some will be merged, and some may unfortunately leave the market. So certainly exports and looking overseas out of China is one avenue to bolster demand and sales volume to achieve scale.
Yeah, so a lot of the brands out of the 137 won't survive, it seems like. So how do you see the geopolitical battle over EV production and access to critical materials? How do you see that playing out, and obviously the implications for the industry?
Well, it has a direct implication for the industry. So recently we've seen Europe, which had previously been a rapidly rising export destination for Chinese EVs, adopt new tariffs from anywhere from 28.7% to 48.7% on Chinese EVs. So that will limit the amount of exports, but some Chinese EV companies will still be able to export to Europe and make profit, even eating the tariffs without passing them on to consumers. There's that big of a cost advantage, probably about a 35% cost advantage of Chinese EVs versus a European-made, European brand EV. That said, the tariffs will probably in the long term simply accelerate the already existing plans of Chinese automakers to set up local assembly operations in Europe. And that could be anywhere from Eastern Europe to even Turkey, which has recently BYD's announced an assembly plant to be set up in Turkey as well. So in the end, as I said before, automakers want to make cars where they sell them. And inevitably, that's not bad for the local economy. Certainly, it'll bring competition for the automakers in Europe, but it will provide jobs and continue to build the EV ecosystem there. So that's probably what the long-term scenario will look like.
It's been great chatting with you, and thanks so much for sharing your insights. Good to have you in East Asia tonight. Stephen Da there from Elix Partners. Well, time now for another break, but coming up on East Asia tonight, giving a new life to fashion waste is not easy in China, with millions of tons shipped overseas for recycling annually. But that may be slowly changing as more people, designers and consumers alike embrace sustainability. And on CNA Plus, we'll look at the impact of China's one-child policy and how baby girls who were abandoned or given away decades ago under the pressures of the system attempt to reunite with their birth parents. You're watching East Asia tonight. And on our earlier bulletins, we've touched on issues surrounding the region's demographic predicament. The declining birth rate and aging population is impacting how businesses operate. And Japan's diaper industry, for example, is shifting its focus from babies to adults. Birth rates in a country have fallen for 8 straight years to a record low in 2023. And the country is also the world's most advanced aging society, with 29% of the total population over the age of 65. Now, those figures are pushing companies to switch their business focus. Diaper maker diaper says its revenue from adult diaper sales is double that of those meant for babies. Another diaper maker, OG Holdings, made headlines earlier this year when it stopped making nappies for babies and focused on adults instead. A report shows that Japan's diaper market for adults is set to grow 16% over the next 5 years, while that for babies is estimated to contract 8%. South Korea is also trying to cope with a fast-aging population. The number of elderly residents aged 65 and above in the country has topped 10 million. Now, that accounts for about 19.5% of the society. Now, this age group has more males than females, and more elderly are living outside the metropolitan area than within. South Korean authorities fear that its society is hurtling towards becoming super-aged. Now, an OECD report says the proportion of those aged 65 and above is expected to reach 58% by 2084. Those projections exceed the threshold of 21% that qualifies a country as having a super-aged population. The report also says that the country's population is projected to halve in 60 years due to low birth rates. South Korea currently has the lowest fertility rate in the world as the country's youth grapples with challenges including employment, housing, and childcare. Seoul also has the worst gender pay gaps. The ultra-competitive workspace makes it difficult for women to take time off to have a baby. In 1979, China introduced the one-child policy to curb population growth. And in the 25 years it lasted, an unknown number of baby girls were abandoned by parents who wanted to have sons. Decades later, the women have grown up and they want answers. CNA's new documentary, Daughters of Putian, follows their journey, which began at an event where, through DNA testing, 10 daughters were reunited with their birth parents.
大家看看像不像？给他一个掌声，鼓励一下他。啊，抱一下妈妈，抱一下妈妈。机会了。啊，像不像？有慢出，慢出，一个慢出，像不像？
你们家几个兄弟姐妹？我有3个姐姐嘛，还有1个妹妹嘛。
2姐和妹妹是送出去的，那就说还有1个妹妹要找。我们现场有没有87年的女儿？有没有？87年的谢丽群到场了吗？谢丽群啊，对。
口罩摘一下看看。
拿口罩摘下来，那大家帮忙看一下，像不像？像不像？
像不像？
你看，一家团圆。那刚才新哥打电话给你哈。
其实我们都是本身第一个身份就是寻亲者。妹妹是82年，我79年的，好，当时是我虚岁是4岁。我有印象就是妈妈生了个宝宝，然后到那个后面，有突然发现，哎，怎么没有了？那个宝宝没有了，但是更多的记忆也没有了。
我家里3个女儿，老3送出去，第4个是儿子。因为农村嘛，肯定要生个儿子嘛，要传宗接代。当初就是计划生育催得紧啊，第3胎要结家了。
去南京还是南京？对。
走心走力都力来劝我要送出去。我们女人就是苦了，没有生个儿子就是肚子不争气了，要是生个女儿就是抬不起头了。
妹妹，跟你走来。
口罩摘了，赶紧摘了，摘了。那要不在这里给爸爸磕个头吧，好不好？愿不愿意？好，姑爷一起来，这个是必须要有的，对不对？来，结婚的时候还没磕头的，要的，可以的。你是爸爸是必须的。哇，哦，
那我们有请我们的父母方林木泉，有请林木泉。
我有个姐姐在别人家里，就是为了生我，然后因为有这个计划生育的这个政策，所以说呢，就把她送走。对我的影响，应该说会让我觉得我要去减轻我的这种愧疚感，有一种希望能够做一点什么的这种冲动。
也叫孝顺节。
我并不认同政策能够解释这一切，很多都是家里面已经有儿子，又生了女儿，然后就把女儿送走，因为养不起，然后就想再生儿子，但有3、4个儿子也养得起，反正多一个女儿就觉得养不起。这样的事情并不是因为计划生育而才发生的，这个政策可能是雪上加霜，但首先是因为有那个雪的存在。
And you can catch Daughters of Putian at 9 p.m. on CNA tomorrow. And you can also watch it later on Me Watch or CNA Insider's YouTube channel. And staying in China, where it is home to some of the world's largest online fashion retailers, with platforms such as Shein, JD.com and Temu shipping clothes to homes across the planet. And as the globe's largest textile producer too, the country ends up tossing some 26 million tons of clothes every year. But groups within the fashion industry are trying to find solutions to wastage.
At one of China's largest cotton recycling plants, these clothes and textiles are being spared the fate of being dumped into a landfill. Instead, shredding machines take them apart, the first step in giving them new life as other garments, insulation or mattress stuffing. It all sounds ideal, but the reality of using recycled textiles domestically has its challenges.
China should be the best place for post-consumer waste because we have manufacturers here, we have consumers here, we have the technologies built up like in last several decades to recycle the waste, but unfortunately we have some legislation issues that we cannot use post-consumer waste on upcycling, let's say, for garments that we're selling into China market.
This policy that bans cotton from being reused to make new garments domestically was aimed at curbing fly-by-night operations that recycle dirty or contaminated material, which means the huge spools here have to be sent for use far away, mostly to Europe. Dr. Sheng Liu from the University of Delaware thinks China needs a shift to embrace recycling.
So how to really change such a perception, to really send a signal, okay, actually used clothing is not that bad. Actually, we can really take advantage of such commodity to develop or build a new circular fashion system. It's a significant change, and surely we need more clear signals from the very top. And then of companies and fashion brands and from to these manufacturers, and they will have kind of assurance. Okay, making investment in this area makes sense. I can really see the government support. I can even expect a reasonable return of financials.
Until this happens, a small group of designers and young people are out to make fashion more sustainable. Dabao repurposes denims and sweatshirts into fresh styles, selling these at its flagship store in Shanghai's trendy Jing'an district. And across town, Jiangna's fashion label Reclothing Bank skirts the country's reused cotton ban by producing items made from plastic bottles, fishing nets and pineapple leaf. Though costing a pretty penny, it delights younger Chinese who have a growing awareness of sustainability.
首先我觉得很神奇，就是因为刚进门口的时候也听到很多竟然是用菠萝壳或者是玉米做的，但是我刚就是详细触摸了它衣服的感觉，就完全没有想到竟然现在已经就有很舒适的这种触感了，对，觉得很神奇。
While recycling factories, such as the one we started at, barely make a dent in a country where fast fashion rules, Kuo Wentang has faith in the future.
The generation born after the millennium, that the way of thinking is so different. Yeah, so that's why I see like we need some time in Chinese society. We need some time after maybe 1 or 2 generations that recycling is something running in their veins, that it's part of their habits.
So, a bit more of a wait to see real game changers in tackling China's textile waste problem.
And that wraps up East Asia Tonight this Friday. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cnn.asia and CNA 938 Radio. You can also look us up on Facebook, YouTube, and on X. We'll have a great Friday and a great weekend. Thanks for watching.